Morning everyone and welcome to Learn with Lorna 135 Further Stories of Migration. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Portree, Wick and Fort William. This series is brought to you by Highlife Highland at no cost to the viewer. Highlife Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then please do so. It makes a real difference to us, and there's a link to be able to do so in the text of this film, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube. This week we are revisiting a subject that always captures people's interest: migration. I think it's of constant fascination to people because it's so much a part of the identity of the Highlands and Islands, and then of course part of the identity of Scotland. It's something which has huge ramifications here still, and also because of the diaspora that it created, the thousands of people across the world who feel a connection to the Highlands and Islands because their ancestors were here. So there's so many people who feel a connection to this subject. And also, of course, it's a human story of people's experience, and that is something that I find in my job always captures people's attention. I covered this subject previously in Learn with Lorna 75 as a dedicated subject around migration, but also the subject of Highlanders on the move across the world has come up in various other Learn with Lorna episodes. So people moving from the Highlands to India, to the Caribbean, to leave to go for work, for trade, for military duties, to play a part in the Caribbean slave economy. Some people going for a better life, some people going because there's literally no other choice or very little other choice. And for this episode, I am going to again dive into our collections to find some more of those stories of people who left the Highlands and Islands. Why did they leave? What was their journey like? What was life like when they got there? Was there work? What kind of reception did they get? How did they remain connected to home? And also, how was this recorded and reported back in the Highlands? And what was the impact that it had at the time? We know, of course, that many left the Highlands as a result of the clearances, and that's probably what people are mostly associating with this subject. And I've done previous Learn with Lornas on the clearances, so I'm not going to go into that in detail, but we do have documents that illustrate some of the ways in which life was continually hard for many people in this part of the world. There was poverty, there was hardship. And this can be illustrated in this document, which is from our Lochaber Archive Centre. And it's something I've possibly read before, but I wanted, if so, to share it again because it's very much sets the context for what we're talking about. This is from the Kilmallie Parochial Board minutes of the 29th of September, 1846. And the Parochial Board write that they're of the opinion that there is not in the parish a sufficient quantity of grain for supporting the population for more than 6 weeks, while the potato crop is so completely diseased as to be utterly useless. The number of people who will require aid is about 2,500, or nearly 1/2 of the whole population of the whole parish. And it goes on to advise that to provide for those people who are going to be in need, that the proprietors in the area should undertake an inquiry into the circumstances of the people and their land, and then make a plan to go forward. So we can see that not only is the grain crop failing, the potato crop is completely diseased. And so for some, conditions were unbearable, and they would seek assistance in some cases from wherever they could to go beyond Scotland for a better life. And as I say, I'm very much simplifying that and making it sound like a choice, but there are so many different reasons why people have left over the centuries. Many of the people who decided to leave in this sort of period turned to the emigration societies and schemes for financial support. So for instance, the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society, which was, and I quote, set up by private subscription to alleviate destitution in the Highlands by promoting and assisting the emigration of Highlanders to Australia. And between 1852 and 1857, that 5-year period, they helped around 5,000 people leave the Highlands and Islands to go to Australia. Mostly the lists of the emigrants went with the ships that took them. So this is a question we get asked very frequently. People will come to us and say, do you have the lists of my ancestors who left? By and large, the answer is no, because the manifest would go with the ship to be ticked off, basically as you would with a stock. If any of you have worked in retail and done a stock delivery, that manifest where you tick off what's come in the delivery is the equivalent. So people at the other end would mark off who had come in the ship. But a few collections do exist. For instance, the records of the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society are held in the National Records of Scotland, and there's a useful guide to that on their website. There are some in archives. So for instance, in the Lochaber archive, we have a list of families who left the Lochiel estates on one particular day. And that's a very interesting document. It details not only whether they went on their own account or whether they applied for financial assistance, whether they got clothes supplied by an emigration society, and also what happened to the land and the croft that they left behind. So that's a very useful and interesting document. We also have at the Highland Archive Centre some documents relating to the Hector, which is marking its 250th anniversary this year of sailing, and the Hercules. So there are some pieces about. But generally, our advice would be, if you're looking for a manifest or a list of passengers, to start at the port of arrival. Some people looked locally for their support rather than looking to an emigration society or a national or regional body. Some people would look to local churches, local parochial boards for support. And this is an 1865 extract from Kincardine Poor Relief Minutes, and that shows an example of this. The inspector stated that on the 23rd of June last, Janet Fraser called on him with her daughter Sarah Fraser, an inmate of the Tain Poorhouse and chargeable to this parish for some years back, requesting that her daughter could be provided with clothing to bring her out to a sister in Australia. The inspector, after making particular inquiries of the person under whose charge Sarah Fraser was to be brought, and being satisfied that the mother's statements were so far correct, and also considering that the board would have had to maintain her for 12 months yet, provides clothing suitable for the voyage to the amount of 35 shillings, which was approved. So you can see there that people are going to their local parochial board for financial support, in that instance for clothing, to join a sister in Australia. And it's quite interesting there to see the way the parochial board have, of course, gone and checked up to make sure the facts are all right, but then have gone, well, if we need to outlay this, but on the other hand, if we are responsible for her care for the future, probably giving her this and essentially getting rid of her to Australia is going to be cheaper for us. So that's quite interesting. Some asked for financial assistance from friends and relatives. This is a letter held in our Caithness collections at Nucleus. It is dated Wick, the 7th of June, 1852. Confidential. My dear John, with a view to bettering my circumstances, I intend leaving this country about the middle of July for Australia. I have not come to this conclusion rashly, and Mr. Henderson, whose advice I asked, not only approves of the step, but consents to let me go, although he could have kept me for some time longer. I'm not led away by the gold fever, but I believe the present to be a most favourable time for one in my way to get a permanent appointment, from the fact that many of the public offices, banks and commercial houses are almost deserted. It will take a larger sum for passage and outfit than I will ever be able to raise after paying a few trifling debts here. And if you would oblige me with a few pounds, say from £8 to £10, I will feel ever grateful, and I will faithfully repay you. Underlined. It will put you to no inconvenience, and it will do me a great service. And from what you have hitherto known of me, I expect you will have so much confidence in me as to oblige in the manner requested. My brother William left for Australia in March last, and having accompanied him to London, it cost me about the sum I now ask you for before I got back. Otherwise, perhaps I might have managed without your aid. Do not be afraid to advance me the sum asked, as, if spared, I will assuredly repay you with my first earnings. I am sorry to be obliged to ask you, but it is an old saying that necessity has no law, and I hope you will excuse me for troubling while I remain, my dear John, yours ever sincerely, James Manson. P.S. John Bain goes out along with me. William Gunn, messenger, his wife, and some of his brothers go also, but they are not going until August. In fact, there is a pretty general feeling here to leave the old country. I shall expect to hear from you either favourably or otherwise at your earliest convenience. Really interesting letter, because it very nicely illustrates, from my point of view, not only that appeal to friends and family for financial support, but also the reason for going, with the aim of bettering my circumstances. It also includes references to the gold fever. I'm not going because I've been led astray by these rumours of gold that's there for the gathering. And the references also in that letter to others who are going, who have made the journey ahead, like his brother, or those who will be making the journey. And that final sentence, there's a pretty general feeling here to leave the old country. And that's a huge part of this story, chain migration, one person going and encouraging another person, and then settling on the other side. It's an absolutely fundamental part of how this worked. Of course, when people did go, the journeys were always incredibly long and often very grueling. There was often sickness and death common. And you may remember some time ago, I shared this letter written by William Michael. I say I've shared it before because it is the most extraordinary letter. I was trying to avoid using extraordinary, but it's such a descriptive letter. You can picture what's happening. And he speaks in that letter of having 2 children dead since I last saw you. He reports that 47 people died on the voyage to Australia, including 40 children. And he says, make up your mind and come soon. But he advises his brother, who he's writing to, not to come if there's anything wrong with his health, as they put so many on board and the foul air simply destroys weak children. Disease was often rampant in these ships, and in that same letter, William Michaels notes his relief that although there was much death and much ship fever, he's so relieved that there was nothing like measles or smallpox to run rampant through the ship. Now, you would imagine perhaps, although it's hard for us to imagine what we would do in similar circumstances, but you would imagine perhaps that anyone knowingly carrying a disease would not want to pass that on. But much like COVID, where people took those decisions based on their own circumstances, do I just go into that setting knowing I might be carrying an illness, but because it's so important to me to get to that point? I found that a really interesting parallel as I was reading this. This is a letter written in 1773 by Simon Fraser, written to his brother William Fraser of Colbokie, who incidentally had been involved with the 1745 Jacobite Rising and had been pardoned under the Indemnity Act 2 years later. It's already an interesting story. But in this letter, Simon, writing to his brother William, says this: Dear brother, we arrived here in very good time Saturday night and in good health, excepting little Jeanie, who turned very sick the night we were on the road. She has broke out in pimples. Whether it's the smallpox or not, I know not. We endeavour to persuade people that it is not. It's still doubtful whether I can get her on board, but I cannot detain Sanders longer. Our transport is good and large. The Pearl, by name, carried 400 souls last year to America, and to our comfort, our number is only 200 and something full passengers, 208, I think. The passengers have the whole ship. The captain and sailors have a room. The passengers have the whole ship. The captain and sailors have a round room upon the deck. There is no extraordinary expense on this cabin, and the contractors are to appoint it. I can have myself, my wife, and my daughter there, I believe, if I separate from the rest of my family. There's little odds, as it's much confined as the rest, only that it's better aired and lighted. The captain is very clever and humane. I am just now told that we are to be mustered in a few hours, and that will decide Jeanie's fate. He goes on to say there's a gathering here of the whole tribe of Macdonnells. I am with affection and regard towards you, Mrs. Fraser, Mrs. Stewart and family, and own and declare that you have dealt nobly and friendly with me in all, with which my wife joins me. Farewell, dear brother, yours forever. So really interesting there that he says, my daughter's not well, it could be smallpox, but we're endeavouring to persuade people that it's not, because the aim of getting there is so important to him that he will try and essentially smuggle his daughter's illness past people. It might not be smallpox, but it might be. And I just found that a really interesting comparison to COVID, of people making those judgment calls around, do we risk putting someone else in danger, or what's the least worst decision? What's very interesting to note about this, so as I say, he sailed with the Pearl, another 250th anniversary this year, but interesting to note that when the Pearl landed, it was reported in the New York Journal that about 25 children had died of smallpox on the journey. There's references to Simon's family life beyond that. Apparently he died in jail after fighting in the American Revolutionary Wars, but I didn't see any references beyond that to Jeannie. Doesn't mean that I haven't delved into this, so there may well be, but I wonder if she was one of the children that died, and also if 25 children died of smallpox, did she take it onto that ship? Perhaps, perhaps not, but it's an interesting thought about people making that decision of whether to go into that place or not, with a potential risk for others. Once people got to their new countries, what was life like for them? Across all of our archive centres, we hold letters that give us an idea of this. So this is an extract from the Highland Archive Centre, a letter written by the emigrant George Urquhart, written from Pictou in Nova Scotia to Roderick Mackenzie of Redcastle, written in 1824. And he writes, as respects land, you can buy it at various prices, from £20 a 100 acre to £100, according to the quality and situation of it, and also what improvements or clearing it may have on it. We do not have much winter here that is snow and frost until after Christmas, but we will have plenty of it from Christmas until May. They do not begin to plough here until about the 1st of May, and they are not done planting until about the 1st of July. And after all, they begin to reap here in August, and considering the whole, I think you will do better here than where you are. If I will be spared, I will expect to send some money home to my grandmother in next May. I think myself far happier here than at home, and I think I have already made more here than I would do in all my days at home. There is no tradesman in the country living on his trade without some land. Money is very scarce here, and there is too much credit given, for a great many of the farmers went so far into debt that they were obliged to give up or sell their farms to pay for it. Once you get or buy land here, you pay no rent for it. It is yours, for it is your own and your heirs forever. And so he's, there's an interesting summary there of the difference between the agricultural situations in Canada and also and home, but also that encouragement to, I'm making more money here, I'm doing better, you can own your own piece of land. That's a huge part of it as well. But also I think you would do better here if you came. And of course I'm saying Canada there, but it would be another 43 years before the Dominion of Canada would be founded, with Nova Scotia as one of the original provinces in that. This is an example from Nucleus from our Caithness collections, written a few years later in 1832, again from Pictou. Interesting to wonder if those two people met and their stories have ended up back here 100 and 200 years later. This letter was written by Alexander Munro to his nephew Simon. He's writing back to his nephew back in Wick, and I wanted to just share some snippets from it. I'm not going to read the whole letter, but just some different things that illustrate different points. So he says to his nephew, and this is much more formal in tone than the other letters, I remember recommending to you merchandise rather than farming, being thereby influenced by my own experience in both here as well as in Britain. So he's saying, don't come out as a farmer, come out, if you can, go into manufacturing merchandise and selling. As a commencement of a mercantile concern, should you think of trying your fortune in this place, I believe that if you could raise a credit of even £500 on the guarantee of your prospects from your uncle's estate, aided by the assurances of your friends, and bring here that value in the manufacture of Aberdeen, Glasgow or Manchester, or all of them, including a small selection of superfine and inferior clothes. You could hereby lay the foundation of a respectable concern, more particularly, as you can find in Halifax, Nova Scotia, credit for any quantity of groceries, wines, liquors for which you could bring from Britain. So he's saying bring out stock, raise some credit, bring out manufacturing stock, fabrics and clothing from Aberdeen, from Glasgow, from Manchester, and then look at selling them here. He goes on to say, I have personally known many persons who cannot do well anywhere have gone from here to the Canadas, spreading evil reports of the place they had left in the like manner that many who came here in the full expectation of gathering dollars in the streets returned to Britain, spreading all manner of evil reports of the country to cover their own inability. So saying that the market is there, the jobs are there, the money is there, but essentially you have to work for it. So there are people who don't make it and then go back saying, don't bother going there, it's terrible. But he's saying they're spreading reports to cover their own inability to make the money. He goes on to say, I need not tell you that from the nature of the country, the inhabitants are daily acquiring wealth and stability. And should you think of coming to settle amongst them, you are sure of my knowledge and experience of the people to ensure the prevention of bad debts, to procure custom, and also to initiate you in the manner of our fisheries, a material part of our trade. He goes on to say that the fisheries are conducted with profit, the various ramifications of which and how blinded with our commerce in general, is impossible for me to describe by any method in simple correspondence. So if you want to really understand how the trade works, how the fisheries work, there's no point me trying to write that to you. When you're here, I'll really detail and explain it to you. If you propose coming here in the mercantile line, it would be proper to give me the earliest intimation of your intention to enable me to look out for a proper place for you. You'll like this bit. If you come here, get a wife, but be sure she has money. Otherwise you can pick and choose of the penniless lassies here. I beg to hear from you on receipt hereof. Meanwhile, convey my most affectionate best wishes to your aunt and my other beloved cousins in Caithness, and believe me to be my dear nephew, your very affectionate uncle. Interesting in those that we've read so far, that so many of them, and so many others that I haven't read you, encourage people to come. They're saying, there's a better life out here. You need to work for it, but it's here. Come, you'll have a better chance here. But there's a letter in our Lochaber Archive Centre written in 1851 from New Brunswick by a Mr. Sibbald. He had already been in Van Diemen's Land, so in Tasmania, but he's writing at this point to Duncan McMaster in Fort William, and he's writing from New Brunswick by this point, so he's obviously fairly travelled. He describes the fact that he liked Van Diemen's Land very much, but the land sold at a very high rate, and so many are now going on from Australia to New Zealand. And it's another anniversary this year of the first Scottish settlers in Dunedin. So he's now in New Brunswick, and he is writing of having a hard battle to make ends meet. And his letter says, totally differently from the others we've looked at, if you can do anything at home, stick there would be my advice. So he's obviously struggling and saying it's not all, it's kind of billed to be this glorious new easy life. For those who did go and settle in their new places, whether that was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, one thing that would have brought a lot of comfort, I think, in bad times and a lot of joy in good times were the many Caledonian societies, St Andrews societies and similar groups that were created by the Scots abroad. At the Highland Archive Centre we hold records of the Caledonian societies of Kenya and Zanzibar, which were formed in the early 1900s, with the Caledonian Society of Zanzibar stating this as its aim, that they want to foster social intercourse and maintain brotherhood among Scottish residents in Zanzibar, preserve the Scottish national character and institutions, celebrate Scottish anniversaries, and give a helping hand to Scotsmen in distress. And Caledonian societies were common, or under various titles, was a very common thing to do. But I wanted to tell you about one more localised society, which my colleague Valerie in Nucleus brought to my attention. The wonderful Valerie I've spoken about a lot. She brought this to my attention. The Toronto Caithness Association, which was extensively reported on back home in Caithness in the John O'Groat Journal. The Toronto Caithness Association was created in 1876 specifically to keep alive the memories and traditions of Caithness, to create a place for people that shared a connection to Caithness, to give them a place where those people who had that shared association could chat, to reminisce, to have a bit of the good old Caithness crack, but also again to assist natives of Caithness in procuring suitable employment, because by this point there was a large population in Toronto that had come from Caithness. The first social gathering saw 100 people attend. Its fortunes, like everything, kind of waxed and waned over its first few years, but from 1888 onwards it thrived and was hugely appreciated by those in Toronto because they could remain in contact with home. But it was also hugely appreciated by the people back home in Caithness because they were able to hear news of friends, news of family, but also were comforted in the knowledge that if their children emigrated, they would be met, as they said, by a real Caithness welcome at the other side. Membership of the Toronto Caithness Association was broad. It spanned across all who were Caithness people, regardless of their position in society. And indeed, it's quite interesting to note that there was pride in the fact that many people had come from humble beginnings and were making a life for themselves in Canada. And so there was no kind of shame associated with that. There was no class distinction around this association. And some of them do have more of that. This association had two main events held each year, as well as their regular meetings. They held a social gathering in January, usually to mark the Old New Year, and a summer picnic. Both of these were accompanied, as you might imagine, by dancing, by songs, by piping, by traditional music and stories. And both were well attended, hundreds of people turning out for both the winter social dance and the summer picnic. Interesting as well to note that there were the women in the association, and there was a ladies' committee, played a huge part in that. So providing the entertainment, providing the food for these events, as well as taking an active role in recruiting for new membership. Also interesting to note, as Val pointed out to me, that single women were able to join because that's witnessed by the fact that the membership lists record many misses in attendance at things. So there's no reliance on a husband's position or a husband's membership to take part. A final point on the great fun sounding Toronto Caithness Association. Unlike other Highland societies overseas, which included a focus on the Gaelic language, quite often there was a focus on keeping the language alive, meeting to speak that shared native language, and also to ensure that subsequent generations had Gaelic. This was nowhere near as important for the Caithness people overseas, who might not have had the language in the first place. They might have done, but they might not. And instead it was the Caithness accent and that very distinctive dialect that I've spoken about before that would come to life at these Toronto Caithness Association meetings, where people could relax into their native vocabulary, phrases, speak at speed, knowing that people were going to understand them. And that ability that I mentioned for people at home to read about the society must have been a huge comfort. If you think of the time it would take to send letters, the risk of letters being lost in shipwrecks and destruction of different things, there are numerous letters that we hold that illustrate the problems and distress that could be caused by lack of communication. So there are loads of people saying, I haven't heard from you in months. I've sent you letters, but I think they must have been lost. So imagine just being able to open your local newspaper and know that you could see what the Caithness Caithness Association had been doing, and that if you had family members there, that you would know what they were involved in. The Facebook of its time, and I'm probably showing my age saying Facebook now as well. But one 1866 letter written by Angus Gollin indoors next to Loch Ness, written to his brother John in Argentina, illustrate this because it opens, "I was dead to you and you to me, but thank God I have received your lovely letter, and you can't understand what joy it gives to us." He had written to the British consul in Buenos Aires to advertise in the papers after letters had gone astray, and he says to his brother, "I gave up hope of you being living long, long ago." And that brings me to my final point, really, of the impact on emigration, the impact that mass emigration had on the people left at home. It's a huge topic, and as I said at the beginning, there are still issues and ramifications resulting from it. But I just wanted to share a few extracts that illustrate the situation as it was seen at home in the 17 and 1800s. So for instance, in the 1811 and 1812 Rogart census, so before the 1841 census, that sort of first official full census of in Britain, there were censuses carried out, but they were really just a head count. They don't contain information about individuals. They're just kind of summarising how many people are in each area. We have some copies of these early 1811 and 1821 censuses. And both for the parish of Rogart, both the 1811 and the 1821 show a decrease in population compared to the predecessor. So to explain the 1811 decrease, Alexander Gunn, the local schoolmaster who had compiled the census, writes this: "The population of this parish in 1801 was 2,022 persons, and at present, as appears by the above statement, it is only 126 more, though within the district there is perhaps an addition of 100 by the influx of new settlers from neighbouring districts. It is, however, so that the census has gone up a little bit, but it is, however, to be remarked that subsequent to 1801, no less than 20 families have left this parish, either by the poor resorting to places that might afford them more regular employment, but others by emigrating to America. The pleuretic fevers 1809 to 1810 have also greatly depopulated the parish by the general disposition of the native young men to enter, in one shape or another, the service of their country." So he's saying there's been, the poor have been moving elsewhere in search of work, people have emigrated to Australia, there's been fevers that have brought down the population, young men have gone into the service of their country. He says that the chief cause, he thinks these together are the chief causes of the population not growing in the way he would have expected it to. The census for 1821 shows this problem continuing. So in 1811, as I said, there are around about 2,148 people, and then by the next one, there's 1986. So there's a drop of 162 people in 10 years. And at this point, Alexander Gunn, again the same schoolmaster taking that next census, writes on it: "The decrease is attributable to the conversion of many small farms into extensive sheep walks, and the consequent necessity of removals as far as the sheep farming system has extenuated." And so that change in the land use that we discussed in the clearances weeks, the way the landowners were taking away common grazing, were changing the land use, extending sheep farms and deer farms and moving people out onto worse land, and then the resultant emigrations, is a huge part of why he sees at the time that the change in population. But I thought that some of the most striking and moving accounts were found in the statistical accounts, and I read so many that I could have shared with you, but I've just picked a couple. So for instance, the Duranish statistical account, the first statistical account of 1792, Isle of Skye, records that between August 1771 and October 1790, 8 large transport ships have sailed with emigrants bound for America. And the writer estimates that about 2,400 people have gone on these ships. This is an extract from the Glenelg statistical account of 1845. The ancient population must have been very considerable, probably double at least of what it is now. The decrease is to be accounted for solely by emigration, for to such an extent has this prevailed that America too rejoices in a Glenelg with a population at least equal to that which the parent parish still possesses. This emigration was at first of necessity and not of choice. The letting of large tracts of land to single individuals caused the original banishment of the hardy and numerous race who had for so many generations possessed the soil. This class of emigrants did not quit their native shores empty-handed. On the contrary, they carried with them the means of procuring a comfortable home beyond the Atlantic. The population which remained consisted of those who were too poor to follow, and of a few others who, willing to forego some advantages for the privilege of residing in their much-loved native land, tried to content themselves with sadly reduced possessions, until finding that thus they were losing their all, and induced by the flattering tidings which reached them from their western continent, they too, though in different circumstances from their predecessors, bade farewell to a country to which they had clung on to until they could do so no longer. I think that's such a moving description, that they were so desperate to stay there that they waited until there was no other option. But it's that last sentence of they finally bade farewell to a country to which they had clung until they could no longer do so. I wanted to finish by sharing with you two very emotive and reflective extracts. First is from Boswell's Journals of a Tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson, published after Johnson and Boswell's visit to Skye in 1773, another 250th anniversary this year. I think this is an incredibly moving observation made by an outsider, and Johnson, as you may know, wasn't always hugely complimentary about this part of the world, but Boswell writes here, "We performed with much activity a dance which I suppose the emigration from Skye has occasioned. They call it America. Each of the couples, after the common involutions and evolutions, successively whirls round in a circle until they are all in motion, and the dance seems intended to show how emigration catches until a whole neighbourhood is set afloat. Mrs. McKinnon told me that last year, when a ship sailed from Portree to America, the people on the shore were almost distracted when they saw their relations go off. They lay down on the ground, tumbled and tore at the grass with their teeth. This year there was not a tear shed. The people on the shore seemed to think that they would soon follow. This indifference is a mortal sign for this country." A very interesting perspective to say, previously there was devastation. Now there's a sort of resignation of the fact that we'll probably all have to go soon. And that, of course, is where we get the phrase a dance called America. The last reading I want to share with you is from the first statistical account of Killernan in Ross and Cromarty in 1796, in which the writer not only gives his own opinion of the change of land use and the subsequent emigration, but also includes an extract from Oliver Goldsmith's poem, Deserted Village. So he goes on to write one part, and then he says, "Secondly, in a national view, the consolidation of farms is still more seriously objectionable. Its effect is immediate depopulation. It compels the poor aborigines to emigrate, friendless and unprotected, to other countries, or to crowd into towns with the view of grasping at the casual sources of earning a pittance which may occur." And then he includes that extract from Goldsmith's poem. "Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath has made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. Their best companions, innocence and health, and their best riches, ignorance of wealth." Quite powerful readings, I think. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you've enjoyed finding out some more stories of migration. As I say, it's such a huge part of the story of the Highlands and Islands now and in the past. Please do comment if your family were among those who emigrated. Please share your story with us. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I will be back live with an overview of the Caithness Home Guard records, which are brilliant. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you want to donate to help us continue our work, then we really would be grateful for that. Thank you.